College baseball season's almost here. We are some 48 hours away from first pitch in Division I anyway. So who better to talk about the college season with than Carlos Callazo, Baseball America. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Guardians, your daily podcast on the Cleveland Guardians, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. We are very lucky to have Carlos Callazo joining us today. This is actually the second time on the show. For any listeners, we had, I want to say maybe 2 years ago, right in June. But again, very thankful to take the time. Everything's taken off. Carlos is traveling to follow college baseball, and I have to say, it's Carlos is also in the position of, I feel like is it stressful being the lead draft guy, just knowing all of the people who have held that position? I talk with Cotter a little bit here and there, who's with the Guardians, but it's you have maybe like the most prestigious writing gig there is, just in terms of the people that have gone through that.
Yeah, I mean, it is big shoes to fill. I'm still trying to fill them here 8 years later at BA. I think at this point, I'm kind of like an old draft writer for how quickly some of the people in the past have moved through this position and gotten into scouting with the team, like Connor. Clint Longenecker is with Cleveland. He was there actually when I was first interning. So a couple Cleveland scouts have been in the position I'm in now, but definitely a lot of legends have come through BA in general and also the draft role. So I'm very honored to be able to do that.
Yeah. And just for my own selfishness, I'm glad 8 years later, you're still in the role. But that I've always appreciated. I always say Carlos is one of the nicest people in the business, and that is one of the things will stand. First, very knowledgeable, but just again, good people. Cleveland has never picked number one before. They've had I think 5 number 2 overall picks. Greg Swindell is the best. What is kind of your, right now we see most people discussing 3 names. What's your kind of, so much can change, right? Like this time a year ago, Paul Skenes wasn't really someone we maybe talked about as much as we did by the end. Like this is all caveated with it's early, but like, who are the guys for you? What's your feeling on this pick?
Yeah. I think it's more wide open than it has been in years since I've been covering the draft. I don't think it's regarded as a great draft class at this point. I think part of that is because you don't have a sort of Dylan Cruz or Chase Dollander at this time a year ago prospect who was just kind of this unanimous consensus top hitter or top pitcher in the class. There are some really intriguing bats at the top of the draft. And given some of what Cleveland's done, I'm sure it is very popular to project guys like JJ Wetherholt or Travis Bazzano or even a Nick Kurtz to Cleveland, just with some of the profiles that they've targeted. But I really do think there's a fairly large group of players that have a chance to be in consideration for that pick. There are some players like a Vance Honeycutt, who maybe has a more appealing package of physical tools and defensive profile that would fit in that spot in a typical year, but he just needs to answer some hitting questions. So I think there's really a large pool. I think it's way too early to sort of narrow your focus down, particularly if you're a team like Cleveland, who seems like they always in the first round are underslotting players and spreading pool money around. But I'm very fascinated to see what Cleveland does picking at one, because like you mentioned, they haven't had the first pick. They typically pick towards the middle or back of the first round because they're consistently a quality team. And so I'm interested in just seeing how their strategy changes, if it does change at all, by picking in this one spot, how that impacts their decision-making. And it'll be very interesting just in general to follow this draft class because it is wide open. I expect to have a lot of movement up and down the draft board this year, maybe in contrast to 2023, where I felt pretty good about Dylan Cruz being at the top of our board. There are some other players who kind of joined him in that elite tier. But we had guys like Max Clark and Walker Jenkins on the high school side as well. And we don't even have a high school player in our top 10 as we stand today. So a little bit different. Maybe Cleveland's going to have to cast a little bit wider of a net than typical, but I'm sure they'd be scouting all these guys up regardless of the draft class.
Carlos, I think it was last week, Baseball America, you guys put out the All-American list, and that's voted on by MLB scouting directors. And I'm kind of curious to see what your if there were responses on this or what your thoughts are, because obviously we've talked about Curts and Bazana and Wetherholt and all those other guys. I noticed on the first team list, JJ Wetherholt is voted on by the scouting directors as a second baseman. Do you think that is more, or maybe they explain the context to you guys and they send it in, but do you think that's more because that's just where they've seen him so far? Or is that because MLB scouting directors right now believe he is a second baseman, even though obviously he's going to play short, and we're going to see if he can play short this year?
I think that this is probably the easiest question I'll have to answer on the show. He's listed at second because when we send out the ballots for preseason All-America teams, we listed him at second base. I'm not sure when we sent it out if it was known he was definitely playing shortstop. We will typically, if players are predicted to move positions, sometimes just depending on like what feedback we've gotten, we'll put them at the position they're moving to. Sometimes we keep them at the position they played or more likely to profile. I do think the fact that Wetherholt is sliding over to shortstop this spring gives him maybe an edge on some of the other players in the class. Like Nick Kurtz is a first baseman. Maybe there's some people who think he's athletic enough to play outfield. I think that's intriguing personally, but he's such a good defender at first base. I think you probably just are comfortable with him there. Travis Bazana, he's going to be playing second base this spring, and it seems less likely that he is a player who could handle shortstop. But there's nothing really obvious to me that stands out about Wetherholt for him not being able to play the position. It's just he hasn't done that. He hasn't shown that. He's played third base. He's played second base. He looks fine at those positions. I think ultimately he does probably project best as a second baseman, but we'll see. Maybe in a couple of weeks after getting some looks in, playing the position, that evaluation will change. And I think for a player like Wetherholt, who is so established as a hitter, the fact that he could maybe change his defensive reputation entirely, maybe that's enough to make him that sort of consensus 1-1 that this class currently doesn't have, even though we do have Wetherholt in that top spot. But as far as why he is on second base on the preseason All-America team, that's just a function of where we slotted those guys when we sent that ballot out. So I think if we listed him at shortstop, you'd probably have both Wetherholt and Bazana as first teamers at shortstop and second respectively, but it's more a function of just how we send it out.
You mentioned Wetherholt in positions. I've seen a lot of debates on Bazana and positions. He's going to play second base. Do you think he is someone who could slot in center field? Or do you think he is this a second base where we've seen other players where it's because they can't necessarily move to another spot? Or do you think there's a chance that Bazana could profile into some of those outfield positions as well?
Yeah, I wouldn't hold that past him. I wouldn't be shocked if he did. He doesn't jump out to me as a player who will make that move. Like I kind of think of him as a second baseman. Again, that could just be me getting locked into the fact that that's mostly where he's played. He's certainly a great athlete. He's turned in plus run times in the past. I don't think he's consistently a 70 grade runner, but I think he probably runs more than enough to at least give him a chance to go out there and play the position and see what it looks like. I mean, a guy like Seaver King at Wake Forest, last summer, I viewed him as an infielder. He played some third, some second, some shortstop. I was really curious to see where he was going to play at Wake. And we have really good reports of him looking pretty solid out in center field because they have got a pretty strong shortstop in Merrick Houston at Wake Forest, who's a member of the 2025 class. So I'm not sure that Seaver King and Travis Bazana are all that different in terms of their just pure athleticism. So why not? I mean, I think it'd be an intriguing option if you value center field defense or that center field profile more than second base. If you think the offensive burden at that position is a little bit lighter, or maybe you just think he's such a good athlete that he can be an impact defender for you in center field. I don't think there's really any harm in trying it. So I'll be actually curious to see if there are any other scouts who share that opinion. But most people, I think, view him pretty solidly as a second baseman moving forward. Although, again, we'll see what happens this spring.
Yeah, no second baseman's gone number one overall. So I'm really curious to see what happens between Wetherholt and Bazana. And if one of them can't play short, they're is stuck at second, they are definitely not going number one overall. I can't imagine that that's going to change this season, even if, I don't know. Are their bats special enough where you could see that? I mean, no one's taken a second baseman number one overall.
Well, you know what I feel like? I feel like what would happen in that scenario is what happened with Spencer Torkelson. He was actually drafted as a third baseman, even though he is a first baseman. So I think if Wetherholt or Bazana are going 1-1 and one of these teams are either intrigued with them at the position, it wouldn't be surprising at all if they were selected as a shortstop, even if the team ultimately thought they're most likely to play second, just because if you are going to experiment with that, you're going to run him out at that position early on, let him get some reps, let him prove that he can't play the position. But yeah, I think it's a good point that we've never had a second baseman go 1-1 overall, whether that's a function of just kind of selecting players at positions that you're hoping they can play instead of what they actually project for. But I think it also just speaks to maybe questions about the top of this draft class, because typically you want players with these offensive profiles that Wetherholt and Bazana have at shortstop, or you want them as legitimate center fielders like a Vance Honeycutt, like an Enrique Bradfield type defender. You'd like to, in an ideal world, in a great draft class, have both. But I think the fact that you have these two in Wetherholt and Bazana, who are most likely second basemen, you've got corner profiles like Curts, like Jac Cagliaone, like Tommy White at LSU, like Braden Montgomery at Texas A&M, like Charlie Condon at Georgia. Like all of your top hitters in the class are corner profiles. If these guys were up the middle types, we would have a different perception of the class right now. So I think all of those are questions, and all of those also lead to just making the picture at 1-1 less clear than maybe you would want it to be. I don't know necessarily, like for guys like you who are following Cleveland, like would you prefer for an obvious guy? You probably would, just because I mean it's a better draft class. Like I'm assuming you'd rather have 1-1 in 23 than 24. But yes, those are just kind of some of the like I think any of those guys in the 2023 draft class, the top 5. So Dylan Cruz, Paul Skenes, Wyatt Langford, Walker Jenkins, Max Clark. That's the order we had. We viewed them all in the same tier. Any of those players, if they were in 2024, they would be very easy number 1 prospects in this class. If that kind of illustrates how we view the talent difference.
Jeff, I see why you and Carlos get along so well. His cat was just trying to get on the podcast too.
Hopefully you don't hear her. We'll be fine.
Oh, yeah.
Watch this video. Jeff's cat punched him in the face and one of our listeners created a GIF for it. So we refer to that regularly
That's phenomenal.
Hopefully it doesn't happen to you. All right. I haven't even asked a question about Nick Kurtz yet. I can't believe I showed that restraint. So we're going to do that here in just a second on Locked On Guardians. Before we get to those questions, maybe you want to head out to a college baseball game this weekend. Maybe you're going to head down to the Shriners Classic with Carlos, wherever you want to go. Concerts, sporting events, theater, comedy shows. You can get it all through the Game Time app to see upcoming events in your area. Last-minute tickets, flash deals, zone deals. Easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event, and you can view all your seats in the seat viewer. And with the Game Time guarantee, if you find a ticket in your row and section for less, Game Time is going to credit you 110% of the difference on that ticket. I like being able to plan ahead, but I can still do that in the Game Time app. If you're not someone who likes to plan ahead, you like to just buy tickets by the seat of your pants. I don't know if we'll get along that well because I have too much anxiety for that. But if you're that kind of person, I think Game Time is definitely the app for you. It takes all the frustration out of the ticket buying experience. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Create the account, redeem code LOCKED ON. That's LOCKED on for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed.
Before, excuse me, what everyone likes, going to throw it on Mike. Before we get into your Nick Kurtz question, going back to your last question, I was kind of curious your thoughts with the whole up the middle versus not. Like, how much of the shift, like in this class, do you think is kind of a shift in college baseball? Do you think like 10, even 15 years ago, they would have just put the best player at shortstop? Kind of. If I know that still happens at high school, but sometimes it felt like we would see a guy play short in college who we knew that was just the point. Do we think, is that shift happening in college baseball, or is that maybe something I'm imagining a little bit?
No, I think it probably is the same. Like, I don't see any real change in how colleges are deploying their defenders. I think it's probably just the nature of the draft. Some years you have, and I would actually say it's more rare to have your premium shortstops in the college demographic, just because typically those players are getting scooped up out of high school. That's like the cream of the crop in terms of profiles scouting directors are looking for. So a lot of those elite high school shortstops just never make it to campus. I think it's just a down year in general for up the middle profiles who have proven hitting track records. Like, there are up the middle profiles you can find in this class. Guys like Anthony Silva, he's a pretty good defensive shortstop. there are just questions about what he is as a hitter, how much impact is he going to have, what is the true hit tool. And I think it's a case of ultimately the bat and the offense is the most important in the ideal world. Like I mentioned earlier, you'd like to pair that with a shortstop or a catcher or a center field prospect who at least has some wiggle room to move down the defensive spectrum. We just happen to not have those profiles in this year's draft class, and that kind of leads to some of the questions about top end impact. It's just a lot of players who are battling corner profiles. Maybe it's a case where teams are less willing to give those like premium defensive positions to just the best prospects overall. Maybe they are more like glove centric with those positions, but I haven't noticed that if that actually is the case. I think it's just probably cyclical.
All right, Carlos. I've been doing the whole Nick Kurtz bit for the last year. Going after last year's draft, I started leading into it and the whole hashtag Hurt for Kurtz. Talk me out of wanting the Guardians to draft in number 1 all. Talk me off why I should feel like JJ Wetherholt's the better option, or Travis Pisano, or somebody else. We're not thinking. I know you said you mentioned Honeycutt.
I don't think I'm going to talk you off that one. I don't really think I want to. I think it could make plenty of sense. I mean, the one thing maybe that I will throw out at you as a bit of caution is just to maybe take a look at the college first base track record in the first round. And really, you could probably look at the bonus pool era. There's some better hits previously, like early 2000s, maybe, and into the 90s. But really, a lot of those college first basemen who have gone this high, if you redraft, they would go lower. We did a 2019 redraft this offseason. Andrew Vaughn had a pretty superlative offensive resume in college, as good or better than what Nick Kurtz has right now. Spencer Torkelson was kind of viewed as the top guy. Neither of those players have lived up to their expectations. Both could be solid players and might already be solid big league regulars, but when you're picking this high, the margin for error as a hitter, if you can only play first base, is so high. Even Tristan Casas was a really good hitter last year in the major leagues. But if you think about how valuable he is to the team and what sort of role you put on him, I mean, how much higher than a solid everyday regular would you put on a guy like that right now? So I just think you have to hit on the hitting ability if you're taking a first baseman. So that would maybe give you some pause on Nick Kurtz. But in terms of what Nick Kurtz does well, I think he is maybe one of the most complete offensive players in this class. I tried to find some holes in him as a hitter, just looking through some of the data we have, looking through synergy. Like, is he vulnerable to off-speed pitches away? Is he vulnerable to velocity in on the hands? Like, typically with these guys who are 6'5", longer levers, like maybe there are some holes in the swing you can find. But I actually think his swing is like uniquely compact for a player of his size. The bat comes through the zone really well, really efficiently. I think he's got an extremely advanced eye. He doesn't chase much. His combination of exit velocity, overall contact, and swing decisions, that trio, which is kind of like the holy trinity of like offensive value, he does all of that exceptionally well, on top of being a phenomenal defender at first base. Like there's a real chance he could be a plus defender at first base. How much do you value that as a first baseman? I don't know. It probably depends on like who you're talking to and what your team looks like overall. But he's a pretty appealing package. I mean, last year he was an underclassman playing with Brock Wilken. I thought he was the best hitter on Wake Forest team then. He's got a chance to be the highest hitting prospect drafted out of Wake Forest. It basically, if you don't want to get into Nick Kurtz, it's more of a demographic and profile question. But if you like Nick Kurtz, everything he does as a player, I mean, it's a lot of green flags for me, and I expect him to put up pretty monster numbers this spring as well. So, and maybe the one other thing I would add too is some of the other more recent college first basemen, they don't look like Nick Kurtz. Like they're shorter, stockier guys. Some of them are right-handed hitters. With Nick Kurtz, you've got a 6'5", 235-pound left. Like he looks the part for the position. So in terms of what he actually does, I don't really have a lot of negatives to throw out at you.
I don't want to dominate this too much, but let me just say this. This is why I like Nick Kurtz at 1, just for this reason. Because if you're picking 1-1 overall, like I understand the defensive spectrum and having the defense impact. You're looking for overall impact on your team. But if you're number 1 overall pick, if your fallback is, well, the hit tool's not as good as we think it is, at least he's a plus defender at short. I'm not really so interested in the plus defender at short. I'm picking 1-1 overall. I have a chance to add an impact player to my team. If the glove is better than the bat, what are you doing at 1-1 overall? And we just said Cleveland's never picked 1-1 overall. The impact glove doesn't do it for me. The impact bat does. And I understand the risks, but I don't care so much if the glove is impact. Like you're picking, that's fine if you're picking 25, but at number 1, I feel am I wrong for thinking that?
Well, I don't think so. I think maybe the one other point I would just mention is like a lot of these players that during the draft year and given their college resume, we probably overstate our confidence in like a floor for offensive performance for players in college. Jacob Berry is maybe the greatest example you could use right now. I had no questions about Jacob Berry's offensive profile. He hit for average. He got on base. He hit for power in the Pac-12. He moved to the SEC. It was like, oh, you'll get a new challenge now, a little bit more velocity. Was the exact same hitter. He hit for average. He hit for power. He got on base. It was a great swing mechanically, I thought. There were no real questions. Again, maybe there are some nitpickier things you could find that I haven't been able to find with Curts. But everyone expected that Berry would be one of these other players that even if he's not some all-star caliber, you can feel confident enough in the hitting ability that you're going to get a solid big leaguer. That's a huge question mark now. We don't really know if that's the case. So for as confident as we can be in these hitters, just some of them don't pan out like we expect to. So
yeah, I always go back to an argument on the show is I pulled up Baseball Reference WAR data, and since taking 2000 to 2016, every position has at least one player with 12 plus WAR in the top 20 picks except first base.
Yeah, which I mean that makes sense to me too. Like
first base can't generate as much
penalty, exactly.
Yeah. But it's still interesting that that's the only one.
The best first basemen I feel like are typically drafted in the second round. Guys like Matt Olson and Pete Alonso. So yeah, it's tricky.
There's a nice group in the second round too. We had Cole Mathis on last week talking about a first baseman. We did. Listeners, if they want to go back and
he's got a great offensive profile too.
Yeah,
he does. He was a great interview too. You've got Sleeper. I know a Sleeper article that just came out yesterday. We should talk about that too in here in just a second.
Get your buckets first with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets as any winning $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets if your bet wins. Bet on all of your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same game parlays, exclusive prop bets, and more. Since we're talking prospects, have to bring up FanDuel's Rookie of the Year, plus 200 on Evan Carter, Jackson Holiday at 400, 750 at Wyatt Langford, 1,000 at Cole Keith, 1,000 for Junior Caminero. We're just going to skip on talking about that one. 1,300 at Nolan Chanel. And then Kyle Manzardo right there. The guy everyone wants to see up in Cleveland. If any of these seem like a fun odd for you, just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Shoot your shot, or I guess in this point, swing your swing. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of NBA and Major League Baseball.
All right, Carl, since you did have that the 10 breakout and sleeper picks article for today, there is a first baseman you mentioned there, and Jeff, you brought him up on the show. There's Gavin Cash. So why don't you talk to us a little about Gavin Cash?
Yeah, there are a couple first basemen actually on this piece. If you're really into the first base demographic, it wouldn't be my cup of tea. I'm a shortstop guy through and through, but no, there are some good first basemen in general. Cash is a guy who, had a ton of power, and he showed that last year. I think he led the conference and Texas Tech in home runs, RBIs. It's a lot of thump. He's a bit polarizing at this point. I've talked to some scouts who are really high on him moving forward. Some other scouts are a little bit worried that maybe the swing is not conducive to pro pitching at the same level that it will be in college. He does expand the zone a little bit frequently. But there are also some reasons to think he's made improvements in that regard or will be better this spring. If you look at some of the splits he had a year ago, kind of first half, second half, I think there are some things going on that he probably has figured out now. His first half was phenomenal. Last year, he faded down the stretch. He didn't play much in the summer. I think that maybe could have helped him if he had a little bit more summer track record, some track record with a wood bat, just to give scouts some more conviction that the power will translate to wood. But again, if he comes out this spring and he has a similar year just in terms of production to 2023. And he shows some improvements with his swing decisions, which I'm probably going to be a little bit more bullish maybe than some others on him doing that. I think he's a guy who could move up into maybe day one consideration. Right now, we've got him in the 4th, 5th sort of range, right at 118 on our board. I don't think it would be shocking if he moved up into like top 60, top 75 range with another strong season, just because, again, the college hitters are typically the demographic that teams love to get access to. You want to get these hitters early. They're not going to be, you can't get like project hitters typically later in the draft. I think as easy as you can maybe take shots on pitchers with intriguing stuff or pitch characteristics and trust your development, it's a lot harder to just develop a really good hitter from scratch. So if he puts together another strong season, I think he will join maybe a cluster of impact, slugging, corner, infield profiles that we already have in that range. So he's kind of an interesting guy to keep your eyes on.
I talked about very briefly that a year ago, Skenes was a top 10 guy before the season began, but was not tier 1. Is there anyone who you look at this year who could maybe force themselves into that tier of kind of initial, it seems like most places you hear about the big 3 and then Honeycutt as well, if he can kind of go back to more of his freshman performance, but lower the K rate. Seaver King's a name that's come up. I know a lot of people are very bullish. Is there anyone else that jumps out at you?
Yeah, I think the guy who maybe fits most similarly to Skenes at this point is Chase Burns. He's the pitcher that I would look at as maybe the best candidate to shoot up into that range. We're not getting a Skenes. I think he is if he's not a generational pitching prospect, he's at least a quasi-generational pitching prospect. You're just not going to get that type every year. I would be stunned to see Chase Burns' command improve to the point that we could compare it to what Skenes was doing and just the ease of the delivery. Even Skenes, when he was still a two-way player, it was pretty significantly different than what Burns is doing. But in terms of pure stuff, Burns' fastball, his slider are right up there with what Paul Skenes was throwing a year ago. He gets into the triple digits regularly. He was touching 100 miles per hour. As a high school pitcher, Wake Forest has a really good reputation as a pitching pipeline at this rate, which is kind of funny considering they play in a hitter's haven over there in Winston-Salem. So he's at least starting out the season as a starter role. If he can lock that down this spring, if he can maybe add a little bit more ease to the operation, show a third pitch a little bit more often, I don't think he's going to be throwing a changeup 20% of the time because the fastball and slider are just too good. But if he can add a little bit more conviction to the starter profile, sharpen up the command a little bit, his control has been fine. He's actually one of the few college pitchers we have in the first round right now that has a sub 10% walk rate, which is a pretty low bar for college first round pitchers. Most of those guys are in that range, but this year we have a lot of really erratic reliever risk profiles. But Burns would probably be that guy. I also would push back a little on the fact that I'm curious that you guys are talking about it as a top 3. I don't think it's a top 3. I think Cagliaone, Mike Sirota, Vance Honeycutt, Seaver King, all these guys are in that conversation. Maybe those are just not profiles that are associated with Cleveland, and I think that makes sense. But in terms of guys who are in line to be 1-1 in July on our board, I think all of those guys have a chance. And I would maybe look at Charlie Condon as well as a guy who probably is better than his public perception. He's a fairly complete offensive player overall. 6'6", tons of power. He's a draft eligible sophomore, which is maybe why he has a little bit less hype than a guy like Tommy White, who has multiple years of just tremendous home run production. So Condon is just a guy I would mention as a pretty appealing hitting package, even though it's probably a corner profile.
We really liked Sirota last year when we thought Cleveland was going to be picking 6 to 10 or whatever in the lottery. We both really liked Sirota. I had not really considered him as a 1-1 guy. Just maybe that's because of where he comes from, but I like the tool. I think Jeff and I both like him, but I don't know. How big of a knock can it be where he plays?
Yeah, I think that is the knock. We had a piece a few weeks ago where I looked at 6 players that have cases for 1-1. I think I included Wetherholt, Curts, Bazana, Cagliaone, Sirota, and Honeycutt. And the thing that stands out about Sirota is he does have a pretty solid up the middle profile. I think he can play center field and play it well. There is no glaring hole. He does everything really well. He hits. He has a great eye at the plate. He makes a lot of contact. He has wood bat track record. He can run. He can throw. He can play defense. It's just the tools aren't crazy. They're not like Vance Honeycutt tools. He doesn't have a ton of power. He's not showing a lot of power with wood. So if you really wanted a player who does a lot of things well, but maybe I just think it's maybe a lower impact type than you would typically see at 1-1. And you add in the mid-major school, the small school background. Not that Cleveland is opposed to that profile. They took Chase DeLauder, but taking Chase DeLauder at 16 versus Mike Sirota at 1, that's a different conversation. You just have access to a different type of athlete and a different type of upside, ideally, in that scenario. So I think if Sirota comes out and shows more power, if he gets stronger, if the speed grades look a little bit better, I mean, he does everything pretty well. So see what his tools look like a few months from now. And maybe he's right in that conversation, because I imagine Cleveland has to love just what he does at the plate, how he controls the zone.
With everything being so even, every year we hear rumors that someone's going to do that underslot deal. Is this maybe we've seen some players that maybe were viewed slightly different, but typically it's always been the elite guys go high. You're talking about a window of, 6 to 7 guys. Is this here where Cleveland, I'm sure by the end things are going to change. Like it's a little disingenuous, I guess, for me to ask this, but right now on paper, could this be the year where you see, like, if they decide that Sirota is someone they like and they can save $1.5 million or something like that versus someone who's a similar range to get, they've got that comp A pick, they've got that second, I've got 3 in the top 45. They could really, maybe they're the team that decides to spread it around a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, we saw the Pirates do it a few years ago when there was kind of a cluster of 5 players at the top and there wasn't a clear 1-1. I think we had Jordan Lawler and Marcelo Meyer 1-2, if I remember correctly, that year. And the Pirates took a pretty significant deal with Henry Davis and were able to spread that around and get a lot of preps on overslot deals. I think if you also look at the history of 1-1 in general, almost every team is saving a little bit just because the slots probably don't line up with what teams perceive as the value of the top player. That could definitely be the case this year. It fits with the player pool we're kind of looking at this point, the lack of a consensus 1-1. It fits with what Cleveland seems to like to do in general with their first overall pick. They like to save money early, get another comparable talent with their next pick by sliding them some money. They're going to have more bonus pool money than any other team to work with this year. When you add in the 5% overage of that initial starting point, if they continue to go up towards the 5% overage, which they have in recent years, they have a ton of money to work with. So if they view it on draft day, they say, hey, we've got 6 players here who we don't really view a ton of separation. You start making those calls and saying, hey, will you take this? Will you take this? And if you get a guy who's taking $1.5 million less than the next guy, you view him as a similar talent. I mean, it makes sense strategically to do that. So if things don't change, I think Cleveland is going to have a lot of options. And maybe you don't want options if you're picking 1-1. Maybe you want someone to come out there and just tell you, hey, I'm the guy, and you just happily take that player and move on. But certainly it looks like it could line up that way.
We didn't get a chance to talk minors. I gotta, just in terms of the show, we appreciate it. The draft is so interesting for all of us. It's on the horizon. Baseball is starting. So people go check that out. Make sure you are following Carlos. We'll have all of his information and subscribe to BA. One of the nicest people, one of the most knowledgeable people in the industry. We'll have to have you on again at some point, maybe after the draft, to have some fun talks. But thank you very much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you guys both for having me. I really appreciate it.
And everyone, make sure to send in questions. Justin's going to do a mailbag tomorrow. Thank you all for joining us. Rate and review, download, it helps. And go Guardians, go.